Resisting Wars in Central America, Part 1 by Sanderson Beck. Central American History. In 1821, Central America abolished slavery and followed the example of Mexico's Agustin Iturbide and declared its independence from Spain. In the next year, they became a part of his Mexican Empire. When Iturbide was overthrown in 1823, the United Provinces of Central America declared their independence. That year, United States President James Monroe proclaimed the paternalistic policy toward Latin America that became known as the Monroe Doctrine, in order to warn Europeans not to intervene anymore in the Western Hemisphere. During the California Gold Rush in 1850, U.S. businessmen began financing a railroad across the Isthmus of Panama. It was completed after 5 years and was protected by U.S. troops. Also, in 1855, adventurer William Walker declared himself president of Nicaragua so that the United States could secure rights to a canal. He reestablished slavery in Nicaragua and was recognized by the U.S. 2 years later, shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt helped the U.S. invade Nicaragua to overthrow Walker with assistance from Costa Ricans at Rivas. The United States intervened in Nicaragua 4 times between 1894 and 1899. After another intervention in 1910, the U.S. Marines occupied Nicaragua for the next quarter century. A rebellion led by the mystical Augusto Sandino, a theosophist, in 1927 was not quelled until 1934, when he was treacherously murdered by order of Anastasio Somoza Garcia after he had dinner with him. Somoza established the National Guard, and his family ruled Nicaragua until 1979. El Salvador became an independent nation in 1838, and in 1886 the communal lands were privatized as an oligarchy of mostly coffee growers called the 14 families dominated the country for the next 45 years. As the Depression devastated the coffee market, the Communist Party of El Salvador, CPS, won many municipal elections in 1931. But Minister of War General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez refused to accept the results. The Congress elected the reformer Arturo Araujo, but amid communist agitation, Farabundo Martí led a CPS revolt with Indian peasants. This was quickly defeated by the army, and in 1932, Martí and CPS leaders were publicly executed as about 30,000 peasants were massacred in the infamous La Matanza. General Martinez took dictatorial power that delayed industrialization. Labor unions were illegal until Martinez was persuaded to resign by the United States in 1944 during a sit-down strike, though military rule continued. The Partido Revolucionario de Unificación Democrática, PURD, was founded in 1948 by Oscar Osorio, who became president in 1950, when El Salvador got a new constitution and began industrializing. The elections of 1956 were fixed by the government party, PURD, of Lieutenant Colonel José María Lemus. In 1961, in response to the Cuban Revolution, the anti-communist Organización Democrática Nacionalista, ORDEN, was founded in El Salvador by General José Alberto Medrano. Vatican II of Pope John XXIII influenced Latin America when the bishops met at Medellin, Colombia, in 1968, and were inspired to dedicate themselves to alleviating injustice and oppression. A theology of liberation by Gustavo Gutierrez inspired many priests to become active in social and political reforms. In 1969, after Salvadorans in Honduras were mistreated, the soccer war broke out and lasted 4 days. About 25,000 impoverished peasants were pushed back into El Salvador, and the border was closed. Throughout the 1970s in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, civil wars developed in reaction to government repression and right-wing death squads under General Medrano and others. San Salvador Mayor Jose Napoleon Duarte was apparently elected president in 1972, but Colonel Arturo Molina of the PRUD, renamed as the Partido de Conciliación Nacional, PCN, was chosen by the Assembly instead. After an attempted revolt by reformist officers failed, Duarte was arrested, tortured, and exiled. The United Fruit Company had been in Guatemala for a half-century when Jacobo Arbenz was elected president in 1950 to succeed peacefully Juan José Arévalo, who had been democratically elected in 1944. Arbenz implemented agrarian reform, but the United Fruit Company complained that they were only compensated for their 234,000 acres according to the fraudulent value they had reported on their tax forms. In 1954, mercenaries trained by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, at military bases in Honduras and Nicaragua, supported by 4 U.S. fighter planes, overthrew Arbenz and put Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas of the National Liberation Movement, MLN, in power. Thousands of people were killed as land was returned to previous owners. Taxes on interest and dividends to foreign investors were abolished, and all unions were disbanded. After President Armas was assassinated in 1957, riots resulted in the military taking control. A conservative was elected the next year. United States Special Forces began intervening in Guatemala in 1966, and in the next 7 years, right-wing death squads killed about 30,000 people. In 1974, a right-wing candidate seems to have stolen the election from General Rios Montt. When President Jimmy Carter attached human rights requirements to U.S. aid in 1977, Guatemala, El Salvador, Brazil, and Argentina refused to accept it. The next year, the U.S. banned arms sales to Guatemala. In 1982, General Rios Montt took power, and the World Council of Churches reported that the government had killed more than 9,000 people in 5 months. Under President Ronald Reagan in 1983, the U.S. resumed shipping military supplies to Guatemala. Many changes of government occurred in the next few years, and the Church continued to complain of human rights abuses. The United Fruit Company was also dominant in Honduras, which was invaded by U.S. troops in 1923. The United States let the United Fruit Company take control and rule by a dictator from 1932 to 1948. An army coup in 1963 was led by Colonel Oswaldo Lopez, who ruled until he was overthrown in 1975 when a scandal exposed that United Brands had paid an official $1.25 million and then saved $7.5 million in taxes. After Nicaragua's Somoza fell in 1979, President Carter strengthened relations with Honduras. El Salvador's Civil War. The bishops of Latin America in our meeting in Puebla publicly recognized the legitimate right of self-determination by our peoples, which permits them to organize as they wish, set their own historical direction, and participate in a new international order. Oscar Romero, letter to President Carter, January 17, 1980. Each week I go about the country listening to the cries of the people, their pain from so much crime, and the ignominy of so much violence. Each week I ask the Lord to give me the right words to console, to denounce, to call for repentance. Oscar Romero, March 24, 1980. In February 1977, another fraudulent election made General Carlos Humberto Romero president of El Salvador, as more than 200 peaceful protesters were killed. The Catholic Church boycotted this inauguration. In June, the White Warriors Union accused Catholics in El Salvador of promoting communism and threatened to kill all the Jesuits in the country, distributing leaflets inciting, "Be a patriot, kill a priest." Since several priests had already been assassinated by death squads, the U.S. warned President Romero. The U.S. Congress began holding hearings on religious persecution in El Salvador. Over the next few months, the Romero government was condemned for human rights violations by reports from Amnesty International, the International Commission of Jurists, the Organization of American States, OAS, and the U.S. State Department. The Legal Aid Office of Archbishop Oscar Romero found that 727 people had been killed by death squads in 1978 and 1979. On October 15, 1979, General Humberto Romero's government was overthrown by a coup of young officers. They formed a ruling junta, and a few weeks later, the Carter administration announced that it would send non-lethal military aid to El Salvador. In January 1980, a struggle for power resulted in the civilians resigning as the right-wing general José Guillermo Garcia gained the upper hand, though Christian Democrats joined his junta. In February, the banks of El Salvador were nationalized and land reform was decreed, but death squad killings escalated. On the 17th, Archbishop Oscar Romero wrote a letter to President Carter warning him, "Your government's contribution, instead of favoring the cause of justice and peace in El Salvador, will surely increase injustice here and sharpen the repression that has been unleashed against the people's organizations fighting to defend their most fundamental rights." The Archbishop explained that neither the junta nor the Christian Democrats were governing the country, because the armed forces had the political power and used it unscrupulously to repress the people and defend the oligarchy. Therefore, Romero asked Carter to prohibit all military aid to El Salvador and not let the U.S. intervene in any way so that the people's organizations could resolve the crisis. And he cited the statement by the bishops of Latin America recognizing the right of self-determination of their peoples. After Attorney General Mario Zamora sued Roberto D'Aubuisson for libel for having accused him of collaborating with guerrillas, Zamora was assassinated. D'Aubuisson was generally recognized as a leader of ordained death squads in the 1970s under General Medrano. After the October 1979 coup, Major D'Aubuisson had been forced out of the army, but he began accusing communist traitors on television so that troops would kill them. After Zamora's death, many Christian Democrats withdrew from the government in protest and formed a new party called the Popular Social Christian Movement. But on March 9th, the Christian Democrat José Napoleon Duarte joined the ruling junta. In his last sermon the day before he was assassinated, while saying Mass on March 24, 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero made this dramatic plea. "I would like to make a special appeal to the men of the Army, and specifically to the ranks of the National Guard, the police, and the military. Brothers, you come from our own people. You are killing your own brother peasants when any human order to kill must be subordinate to the law of God, which says, 'Thou shalt not kill.' No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God. No one has to obey an immoral law. It is high time you recovered your consciences and obeyed your consciences rather than a sinful order. The Church, the defender of the rights of God, of the law of God, of human dignity, of the person, cannot remain silent before such an abomination. We want the government to face the fact that reforms are valueless if they are to be carried out at the cost of so much blood. In the name of God, in the name of this suffering people, whose cries rise to heaven more loudly each day, I implore you, I beg you, I order you in the name of God, stop the repression." About 30,000 people attended Romero's funeral. Gunshots and explosion caused panic, resulting in the death of 30 and injuries to hundreds. 3 days after Romero's death, USAID granted $13 million to El Salvador. And on April 1st, the U.S. House Appropriations Committee approved $5.7 million in military aid. That month, the Frente Democrático Revolucionario, FDR, formed in El Salvador as a political party allied with the rebels. On May 7, 1980, the progressive colonel Adolfo Mojano discovered a plot by the extreme right led by D'Aubusson, who was arrested with 23 others. 1 week later, 600 Salvadoran peasants fleeing into Honduras were massacred at the Rio Sumpul by troops from both El Salvador and Honduras. After right-wing supporters chanted "communist" outside the home of U.S. Ambassador Robert White, D'Aubusson was released. On June 26, soldiers stormed the National University and killed 50 as the government closed the university. In October, the Salvadoran army killed 3,000 peasants in Morazan, and more U.S. military advisors secretly arrived in El Salvador. 5 rebel groups joined together to form the Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, FMLN. After Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States, he assured Salvadoran business leaders that he would resume military aid. 6 FDR leaders in San Salvador were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. On December 4th, the bodies of Maryknoll's sisters, Ita Ford and Maura Clark, Ursuline's sister, Dorothy Kazel, and missionary Jean Donovan were found near the airport after they had been raped and murdered by soldiers of the National Guard. The next day, President Carter suspended aid to El Salvador. After the Third Junta disbanded as Duarte became provisional president of El Salvador, Carter restored economic aid. On January 5, 1981, 3 agrarian reform advisors, 2 from the United States, were shot to death in San Salvador. Concerned that President-elect Reagan would intervene, the FMLN tried to launch a final offensive before he took office, but the popular organizations had been so devastated by the death squads that a general strike failed. On January 14th, Carter's National Security Council approved $5.9 million in lethal aid to El Salvador. The capable and outspoken U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador, Robert White, was fired by the new Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, within a week after Reagan's inauguration. In February, the Reagan administration issued a white paper claiming that Salvadoran guerrillas were receiving arms and training from Cuba and Nicaragua. They proposed $25 million in additional military aid to El Salvador with 26 more advisors. By June, the U.S. press had refuted virtually every point of the white paper. On March 9th, Reagan signed a presidential finding authorizing CIA covert operations to support the government of El Salvador with $19.5 million, ostensibly to interdict arms supplies coming from Nicaragua and Honduras. In January 1982, the U.S. began training Salvadoran troops at Fort Bragg and Fort Benning. To keep aid going to El Salvador, the Reagan administration had to certify that it was making progress on human rights. This finding was immediately refuted in the press by numerous human rights organizations. The Salvadoran Communal Union, UCS, complained that at least 90 officials of peasant organizations had been killed in 1981. Amnesty International reported human rights violations on a massive scale. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and America's Watch argued there were hundreds of politically motivated murders, torture, and mutilation by paramilitary forces. The Washington Post and the New York Times reported extensively on the El Mozote massacre. Relatives of the 4 murdered churchwomen complained that the Salvadoran government had covered up the case and had not tried anyone for their murders. Dozens of those in the U.S. Congress were so appalled that they sponsored a resolution to declare the certification null and void. A Newsweek poll found that 89% of those familiar with U.S. policy said that the United States should not send troops to El Salvador. Roberto D'Aubuisson had founded the Nationalist Republican Alliance, ARENA, that drew policies from the 1980 platform of the U.S. Republican Party. The U.S. Ambassador Dean Hinton warned that a victory by the right-wing ARENA party in the upcoming election could be a disaster. So the CIA spent $2 million to help the Christian Democrats. In the March 1982 election, about 85% of El Salvador's eligible voters cast ballots. The Christian Democrats won 24 of the 60 seats in the assembly, but the rest were taken by 5 rightist parties, with ARENA getting 19 seats and the PCN 14. Ambassador Hinton persuaded the parties not to challenge the election results nor block agrarian reform, and warned them that if they elected D'Aubuisson president, U.S. aid may stop. Despite opposition by ARENA, the Christian Democrat Alvaro Magana was elected president, though D'Aubuisson became the leader of the Constituent Assembly, which in May suspended the agrarian reform. In July 1982, the Reagan administration had to certify El Salvador's human rights record again, and argued that the 1,573 political murders in the first half of the year were less than the year before, though the number was more than the previous 6 months. In October, leaders of the FDR and FMLN offered to negotiate without preconditions by sending a letter that was delivered to President Magana by Archbishop Rivera y Damas. That month, Ambassador Hinton warned the U.S. Salvadoran Chamber of Commerce that the mafia that was murdering innocent civilians and Americans must be stopped. After guerrilla commandos destroyed most of the Salvadoran Air Force at the Ilopango Air Base in late January 1983, President Reagan used his emergency powers to send $55 million in military aid to El Salvador without congressional approval. In January 1983, President Reagan issued his third certification of human rights progress in El Salvador, and on April 27th, he spoke to a joint session of Congress urging them to support his anti-communist effort in Central America, arguing the national security of all the Americas is at stake in Central America. In late May, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Thomas Ender, and Ambassador Hinton were both replaced for trying to get the Salvadorans to stop human rights violations. In June, 100 U.S. military advisors began training Salvadoran troops in Honduras. In July, Reagan certified El Salvador's human rights record again, even though no one had been brought to trial for the deaths of the church women or the agrarian workers. And in November, the president vetoed a bill that would have continued the certification requirements. On October 25, 1983, U.S. Marines and Army Rangers invaded the Caribbean island of Grenada, where a military coup led by the Marxist Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Couillard had taken power on October 13th. That government and resisting Cuban workers were removed as Reagan argued that U.S. medical students had to be protected. For the fiscal year of 1984, the U.S. Congress gave the Reagan administration a third less military aid for El Salvador than they requested, but the $64.8 million was still more than twice that of the previous year. On December 11th, Vice President George Bush visited President Magana, but in a toast warned him, "Your cause is being undermined by the murderous violence of reactionary minorities," and he denounced the cowardly death squads. On March 25, 1984, Salvadorans voted for president, and a runoff was scheduled for May between Christian Democrat Duarte and D'Aubuisson of ARENA. During the congressional recess in April, President Reagan invoked his emergency powers to send $32 million in military aid to El Salvador. Meanwhile, the CIA spent $2.1 million covertly to back Duarte, using the German Konrad Adenauer Foundation, a Venezuelan institute, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. D'Aubisson's friend, Jesse Helms, learned of it and complained on the Senate floor, and death threats were made against U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Duarte won the election and promised to end the death squads, implement reform, and negotiate peace with the guerrillas. This was enough to persuade the U.S. House of Representatives to vote 212 to 208 to resume military aid. After a Salvadoran jury convicted 5 former National Guardsmen of killing the 4 church women, Congress was more willing to pass aid for El Salvador. The Reagan administration managed to compile $196.6 million for the war in El Salvador in 1984, and $123.25 million was authorized for 1985. In March 1988, the Arena Party won control of El Salvador's National Assembly. Peace-loving senators Mark Hatfield and Tom Harkin tried to hold back half of El Salvador's military aid for 6 months so that they would negotiate an end to the war, but their amendment was stopped in committee after dying Duarte sent a message from Walter Reed Hospital. Arena candidate Alfredo Cristiani was elected president in March 1989. In November, the guerrillas launched a major offensive but could not get the support they wanted in the capital, San Salvador. The military reacted to this by sending out death squads against journalists, clerics, relief workers, and intellectuals, murdering 6 Jesuit priests and 2 women at the Central American University on November 16th. The U.S. Congress responded to these developments by cutting the military aid for 1990 in half. In the 1980s, the U.S. had given El Salvador nearly $4 billion in overt aid. In April 1990, representatives of the FMLN and the El Salvador government met at Geneva under the auspices of the United Nations. The next month, the U.S. House adopted the Mockley-Murtha Amendment that cut military aid in half again, unless the FMLN refused to negotiate or got weapons from abroad or murdered civilians. In July, an important accord on human rights was reached by the FMLN and the El Salvador government. After a U.S. helicopter was shot down in January 1991, the Bush administration restored the extra military aid. In October, the FMLN agreed to disarm when they were promised major reforms in the government and economic improvements such as land reform. Finally, at the very end of UN Secretary-General Pérez de Cuellar's term, on the last day of 1991, a peace agreement was made. The United Nations Observer Mission in El Salvador, ONUSAL, successfully monitored the peace accord and supervised elections in 1994. The UN also mediated an end to 36 years of civil war in Guatemala in 1996. Altogether, the low-intensity wars of the 1980s had killed more than 200,000 people in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala, resulting in more than 2 million refugees.